Oh, Helen's just said that she's joining us from Montreal, but she's originally from Argentina.
Oh, cool.
It looks like we have a very diverse and wonderful group of people joining us today.
Should we get started then, you think?
Yeah, I'd love to get started. So welcome everyone to our event with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. My name is Sarah Flynn, and I'm here with the Center for Global Education, and we're helping to host this event in conjunction with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. I'm joining you from Edmonton, Alberta today, and that's here on Treaty 6 land. And I'd like to acknowledge that Treaty 6 territory is the traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux, and that we acknowledge all the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people whose food are. This conversation, Sarah, today is a wonderful mirror of the conversations that have happened on this land for generations. We're coming together. You're sharing your knowledge of gardening and wildlife, and together we'll be changing and learning from each other. And I can't wait for you to share everything that you know about this topic with us today. So thank you for coming, Sarah. Welcome to the conversation.
Thanks. Well, thank you for hosting this. This is a real treat. I'm really so glad to see or know that there are so many of you on this webinar today, and I get to share something I'm very passionate about with all of you. So creating a wildlife-friendly garden. Get started then. So just a little bit about the Canadian Wildlife Federation. We're a national charitable organization, been around since the 60s. And our mission is to conserve and inspire the conservation of our wildlife and habitats for the use and enjoyment of all. We do this many different ways. So we help Canadians of all ages discover and appreciate and support our wildlife, the plants and the animals, their habitats. We conduct research and support research in the fields and conservation initiatives. And we work with decision makers to guide the policies that affect wildlife. So a lot goes on. And I'm personally on the gardening team. And hopefully you'll come away realizing that anyone who does anything with their outdoor space is having a great chance to make a positive impact in their world. It's not just simply a gardener. They're actually a lot more powerful than you realize, and we're going to discover. So what exactly is wildlife-friendly gardening? It's basically considering the needs of wildlife, or local and migratory wildlife, when we're doing anything in the garden, if we're creating it, modifying it, and our day-to-day maintenance. So we might wonder, why is that important? With gardening activities, we can positively affect the world around us, both near and far, supporting nature that we love to see, the birds, the butterflies, but the nature we also need to thrive on this planet. And together, our gardens are creating corridors and connections between larger areas, giving our wildlife a chance to thrive in these changing times when there's so much habitat destruction and pollution and such. In fact, there's a fellow, Doug Tellamy. He's an amazing guy. He's written 3 books. He's the University of Delaware's chair of entomology and wildlife ecology. And in his first book, he says, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. It's now within the power of individual gardeners to do something that we all dream of doing, to make a difference. So we get to do something that we enjoy doing, and knowing we're actually very powerful in doing it and doing it consciously, we're actually have a huge impact on the conservation of our wildlife. There's many benefits. Just a few to mention now is gardening and being outdoors is proven to be really good for our emotional and physical health. Our outdoor spaces become safer when we apply a lot of these methods. We feel good knowing we're actually doing good for the world, for our community, for our families. We create visual interest and provide places to explore and discover. And wildlife can be fantastically wonderful to encounter, to find the baby birds being fed by the mother and new insect perhaps on a plant. But there's also some really important benefits that they provide for us. 3 in particular. They pollinate our plants, which we have to have for our food production, as well as other other plants that need pollinating, medicinal plants, and just for our ecology in general. But as far as food is concerned, they estimate about 1 in every 3 bites is thanks to our pollinators, perhaps even more. Pest control, so many creatures keep other creatures in check. And when we disturb that balance, then we get challenges. But when there is the balance, then we are able to thrive. And of course, wildlife, the small wildlife, helps to return the nutrients to the soil, which benefits our plants. So they're more nutritious for us to eat, and they're healthier and can resist pests more. So what is the nitty-gritty of how we actually do this? Well, we include the habitat needs of wildlife. So through food, water, and shelter, they're the key habitat elements we do. And then how we maintain our property, we do it in an earth-friendly manner, which we'll explore throughout the presentation. And you probably do a lot of this already, but we'll go into each one, and then you hopefully can get some ideas as to other things you can do in addition to what you're already doing. So we'll go through food first, and there's different kinds of food. First, we'll touch upon nectar and pollen. And you can see from this slide, there's all kinds of flowers providing pollen in all its different forms, which supports our pollinators. So we're going to talk a little bit about pollinators for a bit because it's a really hot topic. People really want to know about this, and it can actually help you when you are making your plant choices at the nursery, for instance. So Canada has 7 kinds of pollinators. We have bees and flies and wasps, butterflies and moths, beetles and hummingbirds. And we'll just go through them one by one a little bit so you get a bit more familiar. Starting with bees, they are huge in Canada. They are one of our biggest pollinators in terms of their efficiency, in terms of how well they pollinate in our climate and the kinds of plants that are here. And there's actually over 900 native species in Canada, which is pretty amazing to know. We're all probably familiar with the honeybee. It's not actually native. It's brought over. They have to keep reintroducing. They have to manage them basically the way we manage cattle. It's very different to our native species, but our native bees are so important for the pollination of our plants, including our agricultural crops, as well as our own garden plants. And I wanted to show you just some of the diversity of bees that you might see. In fact, if you look at the top left, that bee is a mason bee, and it looks kind of like a fly. So keep this in mind as you look at insects in the future. Is it a fly? Is it a bee? Is it a wasp? Because some of them actually look very similar. Some of these flowers are very tiny. Some of them are large enough for the bee to crawl inside. You can see at the bottom in the pink flower, a halictid bee. It's kind of a sweat bee. They're amazing to look at, beautiful metallic green. And most of these pictures were taken from our wildlife-friendly demonstration gardens, which has a lot of different plant types and a lot of different pollinators coming to them. Here's another one at an early spring flower called a bellwort. And you can see the pollen on its leg, perhaps, that it gathers its pollen sac. Again, so many kinds of bees, they all live differently. They gather pollen differently. They carry it differently. They live differently too. Social bees and solitary bees. I'm not sure if you've learned that distinction before, but here's a bumblebee. They're typical of a social bee, kind of like a honeybee, but to a smaller degree. But a lot of our bees are solitary. Here's a really tiny one that I watched on a bloodroot flower going around gathering its pollen. So many bees are like this, where they're solitary. They'll basically emerge from their nest, they'll mate, they'll prepare a nest, they'll lay their eggs, then they die. And they really have no interest in defending the nest from humans. We're not perceived as a threat. Unless you're actually going to go and squish them, they usually leave us alone. And one thing I'd love to share with you is that solitary bees, most of them don't have stingers. We don't have to worry about them. And the few that do, the stingers can't even penetrate the skin. Very, very, very few can, and it's really negligible. So most of our bees in Canada are solitary. So when you see insects, look again. I wonder what kind of insect it is. I wonder what it's doing. Here, I took these pictures in my garden last summer on a basil plant I had in a container. I let some of the plant go to flower, and you can imagine how tiny those flowers are. Well, there's an equally tiny solitary bee that came and landed, looked inside, and went inside and did its thing. And there were so many of them around. And it's amazing what you notice when you slow down and start looking. It's not a pesky little fly. It's a really important insect that, and is a bee, and it's doing a good service for us. And if you look on this picture, I talked about how some bees and wasps and flies look similar. There's a bee in one picture and there's a fly in another. So the one on the left is actually a fly, and the one on the right is actually a bee. You can tell partly because the bee has, again, the pollen sac on its leg. And this plant is called buttonbush. It's a really neat plant that we have in the garden. Some more bees here. So the leafcutter bee on the top left, carries its pollen on its abdomen. And you can kind of tell them sometimes because they lift their bum up in the air when they're pollinating. They're really neat. They cut out leaves and use them to line their nests. There's bees on our goldenrod plant. Some of them are specialists. They'll just go to goldenrod. And some people worry about goldenrod. It'll spread and take over. And yes, there's some species that will do that. You can also manage them by putting like a barrier underground to stop the roots from spreading. You can snip the flower heads once they've been pollinated so they don't make seeds, if that's your concern. But there are also goldenrod species that don't spread, and again, equally beneficial to pollinators. There's a liatris on the bottom, as well as a hawthorn with another halictid bee there on the hawthorn. Flies are also important pollinators in Canada, partly because of our climate. And some of the flies, there's a large group called syrphid flies or flower flies, also called hoverflies. And perhaps you've been outside and you've seen a little fly kind of like in front of your face, sort of hovering in midair, zooming, wondering what you are. They're curious little guys, and its chances are one of these. They look similar to wasps, but they're actually very safe and they're very beneficial. They do a lot of pollinating for us. On the bottom right is actually a bee fly. I saw that at a nursery and got a couple of pictures. And I don't think I would have noticed that before I got really interested in discovering all of our pollinators. Another group are beetles.
Before we move on to the beetles, do you think we could get a quick question came in off the live stream? And I'm curious about it too, because you see Costco selling those like bee hotel things that you can sort of put into your garden or on the side of your deck. Do these hotels work? Like, will bees come in and move in? And
yeah, it's a great question. I'll talk more about that on a slide later in the shelter section. But it's a super question. I'm really glad that was asked. So good. But yeah, so for beetles, this kind is actually a firefly. It's called a fly, but it's really a beetle. And there are so many species in Canada. We're still discovering different species of different creatures. And we do know that many species of fireflies do pollinate as adults. As the larvae, they'll actually predate on some creatures that we're glad that they are predating on, actually. So it's important to remember that all kinds of creatures are helping us. Butterflies as well. They're not as efficient as perhaps the bees and the flies, but they still contribute. And again, here they are landing on a variety of flowers, mostly native. More pictures of butterflies showing monarch, and we're going to talk about it again in the future slide. We're talking about the flower, the nectar and pollen right now, but remember, they do need leaves. They do need certain leaves to thrive if you want monarchs and any other butterfly, actually, come to think of it. In this case, though, they need the milkweed leaves. Wasps. Now, a lot of people think, oh, wasps, they're just nasty, problematic creatures. But I know yellow jackets, hornets, and the paper wasps can be problematic. They're social wasps. They can be very aggressive in defending their nest. Totally got to be using common sense and be extra careful if you have allergies or just don't want to be stung in general. But two things to say. One is, again, like bees, so many wasps are solitary. Their stingers don't sting us anymore. They've evolved to immobilize prey like caterpillars and grasshoppers, which they take back to the nest. So where the bees will take the nectar and the pollen to make sort of bee bread for the young, the wasps, in difference, will actually take back a live prey. So they're actually very beneficial for growing our crops in the agricultural industry because they're helping keep pests in control, but they also help pollinate as well. So when you look at creatures like you see on the left here, that's a Sedontia wasp of some sort, I'm told. And it was actually making a nest in one of our bee hotels at our demonstration gardens, stuffing it with the dried grass, which I'm told is a telltale sign of this kind of a wasp. They call it like a witch's broom. And I even saw it bring back some prey, one of them one time, which was kind of neat. You see another one on the top right. Might look very threatening, but it's nothing to do with us. They have no desire to harm us whatsoever. So keep that in mind with a lot of our creatures. They really are safe. And if we keep our distance, especially, and aren't threatening to them, they'll just go about their business. Like the wasp you do see on the bottom, it is one of the stinger wasps, a social wasp, but it let me get very close to it while I was taking its picture. All it wanted to do was get food. That was its focus. I wasn't a threat because we weren't next to its home. And I was being very peaceful, doing my own thing next to it. Likewise, I remember in my own home, I've had paper wasps come to the porch where I was sitting on and right next to me scrape a little bit of wood to get some material back for their nest. And it was inconsequential. You couldn't even notice it afterwards, but it was very peaceful. I wasn't next to its nest threatening it. I would never want to nest right around my doorway because that would be very hard for them not to feel threatened if I'm going in and out. But I've had them in trees near my home and they've never, ever touched us, even when my daughter and I were running around the garden. So be careful, be sensible, but you don't have to be constantly in fear when you think of a wasp. There are other sides to them. All right, that said, let's go on to moths. So some of our moths actually are night flyers. These ones here, the hummingbird clearing moth, are daytime moths. And they get their name because they kind of mimic hummingbirds. They'll hover in front of a flower. They won't actually land on it. So we got here different native plants of the sort of a monarda, and then I forget the other one's name. Hummingbirds are another one. They do pollinate, again, not a huge pollinator, but they do pollinate a large number of plants. And again, you remember, they do need flowers as their main food source rather than the hummingbird feeders. They're great to supplement. It's great to see them up close to your window. But again, if you can give them what nature has perfectly designed for their nutrient needs in the form of flowers, preferably native flowers, you're doing them a great service, and then you can supplement on top of that. But I'll talk a bit later also about other kinds of food. Hummingbirds need protein. They get a large portion of their carbohydrates from the nectar, but they get a large portion also of their nutrient needs from spiders and insects. So that's another reason why you want your garden to be kind of organic, because you don't want to kill off their food supply if you want to have hummingbirds in your garden. So talking about flowers and pollen, when you go shopping, when you choose your plants, it's great if you can choose a variety of plants, different flower shapes and sizes, because as you saw, our pollinators are all very different with their shapes and sizes, as well as how they feed and how they live. It's good if you can include regional native plants, because a lot of these creatures, they've co-evolved with our native plants. So while some non-native annuals that are not invasive, like zinnias, for instance, can be great, especially if they don't have too many layers of petals that have removed some of the fertile flowers in exchange for the showiness and have made it harder to find the food, they can still be beneficial if you get the simple kind. But native plants really are the perfect food for our wildlife in many, many cases. So again, it's great if you do want to supplement with your favorite plants if they're not invasive, but do consider native plants as well. And I'll just tell you a little story about native plants. They're so important. Like even if you think of trees, you want birds in your garden, but there's an invasive plant called the Norway maple, which has been really commonly planted all across the country. And it looks the same as our native maples, but it doesn't serve the same purpose as our native maples, because only about 5 species of insects are known to go to the Norway maple, whereas I think well over 200 go to our native maples. And you may think, oh, that's great, I don't want insects. But actually, most of them don't show any effect on the tree to your eyes and my eyes, and they're incredibly important for birds. So if you want birds nesting in your trees, you need to have a food supply available, so they haven't got to go far from the nest, leave their young vulnerable to predators. They don't want to spend too much energy doing that. So if you can have, again, native trees, native plants growing in your garden, then you're doing them a great service. I'm going to talk about fruit a bit later, but again, if you think of all the different stages of that plant's life, our native fruit provides the right amount of fat for our birds that need it for the winter and migrating, whereas a lot of the non-natives have more sugar, which the birds don't want. So keep this in mind as you are choosing plants. If you can get native, that's great. It's good if you can.
Who's joining us near Ottawa had a question. I'm wondering if you've just answered it. Then she said, she's on the Zoom link. Do ants serve a purpose in gardens? So is that sort of their purpose, like that that they could actually be helping to create food sources for birds and other pollinators, or
well,
how?
If you talk about food sources, actually flickers, which is a kind of a woodpecker, but they've evolved to feed on the ground. They specialize on feeding on ants. So everything really does have a role. We're still figuring out what some of those roles are, but yes, they do all have a role. And ants are food for flickers. They absolutely have to have those. And flickers are beautiful birds. When they fly, you see the brilliant coloring underneath their wings, and they've got beautiful other markings on the back. And they do serve other purpose with other plants too. They have a purpose. I remember reading about their connection to trilliums and helping those seeds once they're formed. They feed on a certain part of the seed, allowing it to be easier for that seed then to germinate and grow. So There is a purpose. We've got to find a balance in our own gardens, what we can live with and such, but definitely keep that in mind. And so also when you're choosing plants, a lot of these pollinators, some might be out for mainly the spring, some might be out right throughout the season. You need to make sure there's food if you can, spring, summer, fall, for a variety of creatures that need the food supply. And of course, having a diversity of plants year-round is great. So just again, for pictures, a lot of our native plants are really very beautiful. Some people think they're so weedy. The last slide, a lot of these slides actually are showing from our demonstration garden native plants from Canada and how beautiful and diverse they are.
No, so, you're speaking lots about native plants. Is there a risk at all of invasive species if you buy just a mix of wildflowers from a store?
That's a good point. Yeah, there are some seed packets that I have seen over the years, and they do have non-native seeds in it, and some of them are invasive, which is a really big concern. And people might think, well, what's the big deal with invasives? But I mentioned the Norway maple to you, how birds really don't want to nest there. It's really not beneficial to the ecosystem. They're invasive. Those seeds have been spreading. I was told, like, for instance, in the Toronto Ravine, they're spreading, they're pushing out the native species because of the way they leaf out sooner. They shade out the native plants, make it hard for them to grow. They're also making it harder for some of the wildflowers to grow. So they're changing the face of our native spaces, a lot of these invasive plants. So it may not sound like a big deal, but when you start thinking about how it all impacts our environment and how that impacts our wildlife and how it then impacts us, there's all a connection. So my preference is have a balance. Have your favorite plants. If they're not native, please make sure they're not invasive. And then when you can, when you're inspired, go and find some native plants to your region. We have resources at the end I'll talk about. We actually have blankets we've designed that are normally sold at Home Depot around Mother's Day. Of course, it's a different year. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, but please watch out for them. If not this year, then at least next year. But you never know with this year what will come through. So keep in mind, these plants also have been grown without neonicotinoids. So that's another problem. Sometimes we have these pesticides that are used on the plants we buy. Sometimes they actually can stay with the plant throughout the entire life cycle. So from the seed right through to the adulthood, in which case the pollen and nectar is then contaminated and will harm our pollinators. So it's important to find plants that are not grown with these types of pesticides called neonicotinoids, neonics for short. And I mentioned a little bit before about the zinnias. Some plants have been cultivated so much that the fertile flowers have been replaced with showy petals. When you look at flowers, some of them actually, the flower part of it is actually the center, which is made of many tiny, tiny flowers. And it may not be showy enough for some people. So like the mop-head hydrangea, for instance, as an example, they've basically taken all the fertile flowers that have the pollen and nectar, and they've exchanged them for the showy petals. So you might think you're doing good in your garden, but actually it's sterile. It has no purpose. Maybe it's a bit of shelter, but it really doesn't have much purpose. And again, if you have a large enough garden and you've got a lot of native plants and you've got a lot of fertile flowers, one plant like that will not, be a problem, but it's keeping that balance, finding that balance, pay attention and being an informed consumer when you are making plant choices. Because maybe if you're trying to do good, you might not be doing as much good as you thought. So that's a lot about nectar and pollen and pollinators. We're going to get back on track with another kind of food, which is fruit. So a lot of our trees and shrubs will make fruit. Again, I talked just briefly about it because I was afraid to forget that very important point. A lot of our native shrubs make fruit that have the perfect balance for our native birds because they have co-evolved for millennia with their needs. I talked about the Norway maple. It's only been here for maybe 250, 300 years. It's not long enough for our creatures to have evolved with it to adapt to its chemistry. So we have a lot of beautiful fruit that will flower at the end of the summer. Some will flower through fruit through the fall and all through the winter. So again, if you can have different kinds that will provide fruit for those that are plumping up for migration and those that are overwintering. Here we have in the middle some cedar waxwings. They're eating, I believe, a mountain ash berries. Nuts and seeds are also important. Again, the trees will provide those, the spruce and the pine and the oaks. But also, if you can leave your flowering plants like your echinacea and such, leave them be when they're done flowering. Let them go to seed and leave the seed heads over winter. And you'll be amazed at how many birds will come to your garden and feed from them. You'll have juncos and finches and such feeding from those seed heads. So you've got your own natural bird food for them right there. And there's other kinds of food. So insects and spiders, I mentioned, really important for hummingbirds. Some people, I don't know the exact amount, but some have estimated even up to 80% of their diet might consist of insects and spiders. I'm not entirely sure, but certainly a fair portion. A lot of our woodpeckers, a lot of our cavity nesting birds will go to trees, including dead and dying trees, because that's where a lot of the insects are, because everything in life takes care of itself at every stage. And so at the dead or dying tree stage, you get more insects, it'll attract more birds. Tree sap can be beneficial. Some birds, like the yellow-bellied sapsucker, will come and make holes and it'll take sap, and following it will be hummingbirds and butterflies. Some butterflies actually like to feed on sap. Leaves and bark, again, if we can have a bit of tolerance for some being eaten, that would be great. It's that balance. A lot of creatures are eating a lot of things that we don't even realize. It's only when things are obviously taking over then we need to perhaps step in and do something, but have as much tolerance as we can. When we talk about leaves, a lot of our butterflies, well, all butterflies, they need leaves when they're young to feed from. Sometimes that's trees, and sometimes in the case of the monarch, it's the milkweed. So if you can include plants for their larval form, you're going to be helping them be adults, and you'll enjoy the beautiful adult butterflies as well.
So someone had a question, like, is there a guide online about local native species that they can plant or source out to help with pollinators? If they're new to an area, they have a new property and they're looking for this information, are there guides online that even show a picture? So when they go to Home Depot or their local garden center, they can
really good point. So we actually have a native plant encyclopedia online, which I'll give a link to after. And that has many entries, which hopefully can be helpful. There's 2 tabs. One has a detailed search tab, and you can click on the province you're in, the kind of plant you're looking for, shrub or perennial or grass. You can key in who you want to attract, when you want it to bloom. You can key in those things, and it'll give you some suggestions. That's a great start anyway. If you talk to any conservation authorities, field naturalist clubs, a lot of those people are very knowledgeable. Some nurseries, and we have a list, some nurseries are very dedicated to native plants. Some mainly sell natives. They're the ones you want to talk to because they know also about the regionally native plants. There are some other ones online too. There's, I think Can Plant is a new one that's been recently redone. That's a fantastic resource. I've seen one out west in Vancouver in conjunction with UBC and Metro Vancouver, which is a fantastic resource. So they are out there. Those are some to keep in mind to start, but do some searching. It is a growing topic. More and more people want native plants, want to know about them. So it's becoming a more accessible thing to find out about. So good question. So food, in terms of butterflies, just wanted to say that some butterflies actually do what's called mud puddling. They will go to the ground that is damp, usually wet sand, manure, compost. Even if you're by a waterway and you see dead things washed up like plant matter and decaying fish, they will go to that. They're even known to go to dung and feed, quite frankly. So you can encourage these kinds of mud puddlers, such as swallowtails, and there's even one here, actually, it's called a question mark on the bottom left. That was in our parking lot at work. Parking lot, pavement. But there was a crack filled with earth, and behold, this little butterfly, or big, beautiful butterfly actually, was feeding there. So you never know where you're going to find wildlife. It's so exciting just to look and see it in your own backyard or in your own parking lot. You can actually recreate, though, this particular need of theirs if you don't have a shoreline or an area in your garden which you want to dedicate to being a damp area. Because some people actually just make a garden bed and leave part of it without mulch and make sure that's damp, and then you might attract butterflies that way. If you want with your kids, you can make a little dish. On the bottom right, you see a picture of insect dishes, part sand, part rock. So the rocks allow some insects to perch and drink without drowning, such as our bees and our wasps. Then the damp sand, which is not sterilized, it's regular sand that you can buy, is good for these mud puddling butterflies. So food also, again, once you provide the natural habitat, go for it to supplement if you want. Just some tips with suet feeders for birds in the winter. I would avoid those with preservatives. Look at the label and keep it in your freezer till you're ready to take it out. Seed feeders, the Canadian Wildlife Federation has a line of food you can explore, designed by a nutritionist. But remember, clean your feeders often. Try to keep the bacteria down and disease spreading to a minimum. And sugar water feeders are great if you want to supplement, but remember, no dyes. Don't use alternative sweeteners because they can be dangerous, and clean often. The first big habitat element, it's a big doozy, so that we covered that. Now we'll go a little bit quicker through the two other habitat elements of water and shelter. So water can be as simple as you like. It can be a bowl of water from your kitchen. It can be a fancy dish that you buy from the store. Keep the dishes clean though, especially when it gets warm. You want to keep the bacteria down, and you want to prevent mosquitoes from breeding. So that's something to keep in mind. In the wintertime, if you live in a very, very cold part of Canada where it's really cold for much of the winter, I recommend avoiding bird bath heaters. There's been a lot of controversy about them, I've discovered, and some people think they are fine, but I've heard from one person I knew firsthand who was a master gardener, a volunteer, and worked for the Canadian Wildlife Service. He witnessed a bird go into the bird bath, bathe, when you think they would know better, but they did. And by the time they were flying off and trying to preen themselves, their feathers were freezing far too quickly, and he considered the bird to be in danger. Wasn't sure going to make it or not. I've since heard another person report a similar thing. I've heard of some little birds having their feet frozen when they landed on a metal thing afterwards. So if you do want to have, heated bird bath in the winter, remember they've evolved. The birds that are there have evolved to adapt without it. But if you really want to have it, have a grid over it with plastic cover so that they don't go in inadvertently or get freeze to it. But on a happier topic, we talked about insect dishes with perching stones for beneficial insects, mud puddle dishes, and hummingbirds. If you actually want to attract hummingbirds, they love misty, moist weather. And I've heard of people putting, say, a hose in the crook of a tree branch and setting it to a mist spray and having it run for 5 minutes at the same time every single day. The birds get used to it and they'll fly through it. I've not seen it myself, but I've heard that it works. And again, if you want to conserve water, just keep it minimal, but it can work. Ponds. If you have a pond, that's great. Make sure you've got sloping slides, or if you don't, you've got something that can help wildlife climb out if they've inadvertently gone in and they're struggling. Recirculating streams can be very beneficial. This is our pond actually at work, the two top pictures. And the moment it was put in, it's a natural pond, by the way, no chemicals. The moment it was put in and the stream turned on, the birds came. And we've got a tree right next to it. Perhaps you can see on the left picture, there's a tree at the back. They love that tree. They'll go there, perch, make sure it's safe, then they'll go in and bathe. Go back to the tree, make sure it's safe, and they'll fly off. So again, having a variety of habitat in your garden, a variety of layers and plant types, very beneficial, which ties into our third element of shelter. Are we good, Sarah? Are there some questions that we need to ask? Sorry.
No, it's good because there was questions around mosquitoes, and I think you covered that. And then there's a few questions about slugs and how we can learn to love slugs, or whether we should keep battling the slug battle. I think it raises an interesting question around pest versus, part of our wonderful garden cycle.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll try to remember to get to slugs when we talk about green gardening, because that's a very good point. A lot of people want to know about slugs. Okay, great. So for shelter is very beneficial for cover from the elements, protection from predators, nesting spots, even resting spots, and a place for a lot of birds to perch and spy their next meal. I had certain insect-eating birds that would often perch on, actually it was a snag, it was a dead tree, and they loved those branches, and that would be one of their favorite places to check where the insects were, and then they'd go and get their next insect, and then they go back to the branch. Shelter in general, you can really do a lot of good if you have a variety of plants in your garden, variety of layers, variety of heights, variety of kinds. So for trees and shrubs, evergreen, that keep their green leaves throughout winter, deciduous that lose their leaves in the winter. They're really beneficial for different types of birds at different times. Vines on a fence, ferns even for low grasses for ground dwelling animals, basically, whether they're frogs and toads or whether they're small ground dwelling birds like the ovenbird. it's good if you can have vegetation in some corner of your yard that's kind of thick and giving them that space. And snags, dead or dying trees, just a note about that. If you think, okay, I've got a dead tree, got to cut it down. If you can think about this a little bit more holistically, if it's near obviously a house and a walkway and a play area, of course you have to be safe. You might need to take it down. Maybe it's a strong enough tree that you can just take down certain branches and leave the tree standing a few more years before it truly is unsafe and it has to be taken down completely. It's the back of a property and it's nowhere near a path and people are in danger of causing harm, then please consider leaving it, especially the big ones, because so many of our birds need cavities, which they make in these dead trees. And a lot of other birds use existing cavities for their homes. So woodpeckers, chickadees, nuthatches, a lot of our owls actually, some ducks even will nest in these holes, little saw-whet owls, screech owls. So if you can think of keeping these trees as much as possible, provide food for the insects and the birds, and then they're also homes, which are really important for nesting. You see with the pileated woodpeckers in this picture, on this slide, but also in the wintertime, a lot of these birds that do overwinter, they need many different roosting spots to hide from predators, to hide from the elements. And I was told that, like, some of them actually need several. They actually rotate their spots they go to for shelter to, again, try to fool or escape the predators. So as many snags as we can leave, the better. But of course, keep in mind you need to be safe. Find that balance. Just something else to consider. Let's see, other kinds of rotting logs, good for all different creatures, and then the others that will come to feed from them. Leaf litter. I heard recently actually from Doug Tallamy, he was saying a lot of our butterflies and moths, which will grow in the trees, they need the tree leaves for their caterpillars. A lot of them will drop down to the leaf litter below to finish evolving, to become the adult butterfly that we grow to love, including the hummingbird clearing moth. They do that as well. But so many of our trees, if you notice in our culture, they don't have any leaf litter below it. We rake the leaves up and send them away. So if you can consider, perhaps in your garden, creating a garden bed below your tree where you allow some of the leaves to stay, or if you do have to do leaf cleanup, leave it as late as possible in the spring, and therefore these little creatures have a chance of finish evolving and maturing and flying off. Stone piles are great for snakes. Brush piles are great for all kinds of creatures, including many of our birds. Open areas of sand and earth. So a lot of our bees, I told you, are solitary. The next slide, we'll talk about how they nest, and some of them actually is below ground. Some of them is in plant stems, and some of them is in sort of dead trees, cavities, and wood. Tall grass can be beneficial. I know there's a concern about ticks and looks and such, so perhaps you can designate a corner of your garden to having some tall vegetation grow, including some grass out of the way. But that is very beneficial for a lot of our birds that'll eat those weedy seeds, and fireflies that need the tall grass and the moisture. And then bird bed and bee houses. So you had a question about buying bee houses. I would be very careful when you buy any structure that's been made to support these animals, even bat houses. They're not always designed as accurately as we'd like. Sometimes they're more gimmicky, or perhaps people mean well, but they just don't have all the facts. And we're still learning ourselves. But so for bat houses, for instance, on our website, we do have plans. We have a Help the Bat section, lots of information on bats, including plans. The bigger, the better, because they use them in the summertime when they have their young. And of course, in the summer, it can get cool, it can get hot. The bigger it is, the more they can move around and adapt to the temperature and stay well. Bee houses. The next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. So perhaps I'll just click onto that one. A lot of them are addressing the last category, the wood nesters, cavity nesters. And you want to make sure, and again, we're still learning ourselves, but you want to make sure it's material that's not going to encourage mold and condensation. So avoid glass or plastic tubes. You might want to have something that can stay dry, so has a bit of an overhang, or where you place it has a bit of an overhang. Avoid splinters if possible with the material. If you have wooden blocks, it's good to replace them every so often because, again, things can grow in them. And also keep them small because there are those that are finding that the larger, big ones, like I'm talking really big ones, they can perhaps sometimes signal to parasitic species, hey, feast over here, and then they sort of zoom in. Whereas I know someone, he's a local wasp expert, he's created a series of a few long tunnel drilled bits of wood that he's bundled in 3 and places them discreetly around his property. And that way you've got some homes for them, but they're tucked away. I know someone at a local sort of wildlife-friendly garden in the Ottawa area, Fletcher Wildlife Garden. They create mason bee houses for those orchard bees that come out in the spring. They use rolled up paper in an old milk carton, and that works well. But again, they have information on their website about what they do to bring them into their fridge in the winter and look after them. So if you create habitat with a variety of plants, a variety of layers, you're going to basically allow nature to take care of itself. If you want to start supplementing, it's good to do a little bit of research and see what's what. You can experiment yourself and observe and share your observations. But a lot of our bees are ground nesting bees. So having a bit of open space, having some tolerance in our lawn or the side for them to nest. Keep in mind, you want to be aware what species is it. But for the most part, ground nesting bees are safe. They will not sting. They're very docile, and sometimes they'll nest all on their own. Sometimes they'll nest in groups together, and they might seem like it's a colony, but it's not really something that they would ever defend against a human. It's more a B2B thing. Some of them will nest in pithy stems. So if you have a hollow stem for nesting, if you can leave that bee as late as possible and allow them to finish their cycle. But again, it all creates habitat like rooms and furniture does for our houses. We have a lot of layers and rooms and space to exist. If we were to live in a bare house with no walls and no furniture, that's kind of like not having much habitat in your garden would be like for these creatures. So habitat elements covered. Now, just quickly, earth-friendly gardening. So if you can use compost, conserve water, green lawn care, mulch, and avoiding pesticides. So again, if we do what we were talking about, diversity of plants, you're attracting a diversity of creatures, birds, bats, toads, snakes, beneficial insects that will predate on other species and keep them in check. Match your plants to suitable growing conditions so they have a chance to thrive and be healthy and strong. Strengthen with soil amendments. We'll talk about compost in a minute. If you really have to do something, sometimes a spray of water is enough, or a soap spray might be enough. But start with a gentle, prevent first, then start with gentle, and then move your way along the chain. To improve your soil, and it saves wild spaces because you're getting it out of the garbage and you're preventing a toxic leachate from being formed when those organics mix with what's in the landfill. And it's free. So if you can compost, that's very beneficial. We've got lots of information on our website about how to do that, how to do it well. Conserving water. Again, if you can use rain barrels, water in the morning before the hot sun evaporates it, water at the base of plants, use native and drought-tolerant species. You're doing a lot there to help conserve water. Mulching is another great way to return nutrients to the soil, keep the roots at a comfortable temperature when the sun is getting hot. It minimizes soil erosion, keeps the weeds down. I recommend mulch that has not been dyed because you don't know the impacts that's having on the soil ecology and all those microorganisms that are hopefully in your soil working for you. And lawn care. At work, we never water our lawn and it stays green most of the time. And then we have the really dry spells. It will go brown for a bit, but it will come back. We have as minimal lawn as possible, and we're looking to increase that all the time. We water, again, if you do water deeply once in a while. Or again, like us, not at all. Of course, finding your own balance, but being mindful of how you do things. And again, as you do all of this, keep in mind proportion. So if you have more space, you can have more habitat there. It's a great opportunity to add more trees and shrubs and garden beds and layers. Of course, even if you have a teeny tiny little garden, you might find you can have a shrub, maybe a red osier dogwood that doesn't get too big, that has the flowers and then the berries and has the shelter. Perhaps you can have a diversity of the herbaceous plants, the flowering plants. Keep it enjoyable and do something that interests you. Maybe do one project a year. Just make sure you enjoy what you're doing because there's a lot of pleasure to be had from this if you take the pressure off your shoulders. And of course, wildlife-friendly gardening, I'm hoping you realize, is very versatile. It can suit any gardening style, any budget, any lifestyle needs. Still have some grass for playing, but again, add more of the habitat if you can with garden beds for your butterflies and bees. We have some properties are certified program, Garden Habitat Certification. This one here is a fancy one, very beautifully landscaped. You can have a tidy, immaculate garden that still meets all the needs of wildlife. You can have a teeny tiny little curbside garden that again meets all the needs of wildlife and very simply done too. We've got different resources online. I'll point to it at the very end that can support this. Newsletters, and encyclopedia, and illustrated glossary, which can help you also. iNaturalist is a great tool. It's something where it's a platform where you can go on to take a picture, upload it, and experts and amateurs alike will help you identify it if you don't know what it is. You can do the same. It actually helps with us as a citizen science movement in terms of having new discoveries of new species, perhaps that are in Canada that we didn't know of, which has actually happened already. And also monitoring populations and where they're at. You can create projects for your community as well. That's something I highly recommend you explore. And again, I have a link at the end for that. And I think that I said there's over 1.5 million observations so far in Canada. I think it's way, way higher than that now. I did this many months ago. Another resource we have is our wildlife-friendly demonstration garden. If you're ever in the area, once we are able to move around our gardens again and visit, it's a great spot to showcase all the many different native plants in Canada and these wildlife-friendly habitat features that we talked about. If we're interested in certification, it basically gives recognition for people who are wanting to put these steps in place. And it helps it get the word out to your neighbors. If you wanted to have a sign, you can buy a sign and it raises awareness that way. You can basically apply any time of year. We love seeing pictures of your garden year round, showing how you've got different ways of supporting wildlife. The form is fairly simple. It's online or in print. We ask for a sketch if you're willing to do one and don't have to be intimidated. It can be as simple as you want. It can be as fancy as you want on the computer or drawn. It's a great way to help plan your garden as well if you haven't done so yet. This is optional though. And anyone can do it. We have had schools, we've had businesses. The Conservation Council of New Brunswick had this little tiny patch of land by the sidewalk, and they planted it for wildlife and they got certified. So again, there are 2 different signs you can buy if you want once you're certified at cost to help celebrate and share your success with your neighbors. We get added to a map which helps show how the wildlife habitat is spreading across the country. And it's free as well. It's very easy and it's free. So here are some resources to share with you. So a lot of what I talked about is on our Gardening for Wildlife page. So it'll have the Grow Wild newsletter subscription page. You can apply for certification, the encyclopedia, lots of resources. There's another link here if you want for coloring pages for your kids right now, handouts, podcasts. Some of our handouts talk about what we just spoke about. And during this time when life is a bit different, we have a special section we've created for reconnecting Canadians. It's got great resources for teachers, for parents, for individuals, for a variety of purposes, variety of ideas to do during this time. So I'll keep it on a moment longer so you have a chance to write it down. If not, I can go back. I just want to say survey. There's going to be an email sent out after about a survey you can fill very, very quick, and it'll give you access to our new 20-page color booklet, Gardening for Wildlife Guide. And of course, there's our main website to visit and other ways to connect with us. So a few minutes for questions. Hopefully.
Cool.
I didn't talk about slugs yet. Should I talk about slugs first?
Why don't you start with slugs? It's a burning question across live stream and online.
Okay. So again, everything is balanced. Deterring so-called pest species is never the fun conversation for me because, there's never one perfect solution. If you do find they are a problem, then some people do have safe, gentle ways of dealing it, perhaps cutting an orange in half, scooping out the insides, and they will sometimes be attracted to the sweetness and go inside and you can pick them out if you go early the next morning. Some people put dried up eggshell around plants as a way to deter them because it's hard for their soft bodies to go on that abrasive material. Some people put collars around plants. There are some ideas online how to deal with them. But again, it's up to you to find that perfect balance. If we can, while we do it, increase tolerance, great. If they are a problem, do it as gently and safely as we can for all of the wildlife and the ecosystem around us.
Wonderful. So I'm going to just bring you up on the full screen here. And we have some questions both from the live stream and online. And now if anyone who's in the Zoom would like to ask their question personally, just give me a little wave. I'll see you here on my screen and we'll have you unmute and ask your question yourself. But as we're getting ready for that, on the live stream, Claire was wondering, what, like you recommended, there's been so many wonderful recommendations. And as you said, sometimes it's just taking one project a year and, incorporating that. So if she wanted to do one thing this coming spring to get her garden ready for a wildlife friendly garden and making this transformation change, what would be like the top thing she should prioritize?
That's really tough because there's so many great ones, but I guess maybe just adding a plant, adding preferably a native plant, making sure the plant still has the nectar and pollen available. Pick a plant that brings you pleasure, whatever color brings you pleasure, that would you would enjoy having in your garden. Because again, this is about making your garden beautiful as well as beneficial. We benefit from the lovely layers and the colors and the added blooms. So that's probably the easiest one that I would suggest doing.
Wonderful. And Adeline, who's in Cambridge, is wondering, is there like a do's and don'ts highlight reel on getting ready for the spring cleanup?
Well, I guess leave it as late as you are comfortable. In terms of if you have leaves on the ground, if you're going to cut stems in your garden of the old stems, hopefully you've left them through the winter so the birds could eat the seeds. Generally, you can snip them now, but if you have any plants where the stems were open and you can see are hollow at the top, maybe leave them a bit longer, or don't cut them down quite so low because they might actually have little tiny bees nesting in there. Again, it's what you're comfortable doing. Do's and don'ts is so many little things. Just leave spring cleanup as late as you're comfortable doing, and maybe as you're doing it, if you have the time, be aware of what you're doing. Look in the leaf litter as you're picking it up. If you are going to move your leaf litter, put it somewhere where it can actually perhaps still stay in the open. Like if you have a big enough property, have a leaf pile in the back of your yard, perhaps, where it can slowly compost and offer shelter. Leave it as late as possible. Observe what you're doing. That's the best thing I can think of, really.
And Jocelyn on the live stream wants to know, what's the favorite part of your garden?
Oh, well, if you're talking about the one at work, I just delight going around and discovering who's they visiting. When I'm taking pictures of the flowers for purposes like this, I get to discover all kinds of creatures on the flower, under the leaf, who's visiting. And that really is fun and thrilling to me because I'm always discovering new creatures. There's one flower, I wish I had shown it to you. It's on our website. It's called mitrewort. It has these tiny little flowers, but when you look up close, they're like little snowflakes. And I remember taking a picture of it one time with a macro lens to show its beauty. And there was the tiniest little pollinator on it, which actually just recently got identified by an expert acquaintance of ours. So you never know what cool things you're going to discover in your garden when you're walking around. That's what I enjoy.
Wonderful. So we have a question here from, I'll see if Dominic, I tried to message her in the background, but would you like to ask? Oh, okay, I'm going to unmute you.
Oh, hi. So I put two questions in, sorry. I tried to compost last year and failed miserably. So I'm wondering where I can find good compost tips, or if you have ideas on that. I just don't really know what I'm doing wrong.
Okay. Yeah, and our website has quite a lot of information on composting, the materials to go in it, troubleshooting if you've got different smells or problems. So if you go on our website and you go on the search bar and you put composting, hopefully the right page will come up at the top. If not, my email address was there. You're welcome to email me if you can't find it. Basically, composting is a matter of the dry and the wet, the greens and the browns, because you're introducing two kinds of elements then, the nitrogen and the carbon. So the microorganisms and the other organisms are decomposing that material to make the compost. They get the balance of the food. So if you put in a layer, let's say, of your wet kitchen scraps, after that, put a layer of dried leaves. So we talked about gathering your dried leaves. If you have a place to keep them that you can then later on add slowly to your compost, that would be so helpful. Other dried things can be the dried bread, dried leaf and yard waste that's dried out. And sometimes if you find it is getting smelly, put a bit of soil on. But generally speaking, if you have that balance, your compost pile should not get smelly. It might perhaps if you have an excess of a certain kind of material going in. But again, the troubleshooting guide should really help you if you have a smell going on. If it's not composting, remember it can compost slower depending on the ratio of those materials. But if you leave it be, theoretically after a year, you should end up with some compost at the bottom. It may not be at the top, because we would add stuff to ours and it keeps going down, keeps going down, keeps going down. So the top always looked wet and uncomposted, but the bottom actually was a beautiful, rich, humusy earth material. So I'm not sure if that helps you or not, but.
Yeah, it definitely does. Mostly just because my compost pile that I sort of have, it has looked like it hasn't been composting. And I have a lot of just sort of dry things from my garden. When I moved into this house, the garden wasn't really the way I wanted it. So I have a very massive pile of compost that I just was like, I don't think this is working.
Well, it's funny because the bigger it is, sometimes also it can make more heat, because the heat is a good sign that it's all being sort of burned up, and it's a sign that the organisms are active in the pile. So sometimes the size can matter. Sometimes, again, it's the ratio of the elements. If there's perhaps not enough greens and browns, perhaps they're not getting what they need, so it's harder for them to do their thing. Maybe it needs to be in a sunnier spot. Like I have had mine in the shade in a plastic compost bin, and that worked fine. But maybe if you're in a cooler climate and it's in a shady spot, maybe you need to move it to a slightly warmer spot to help it warm up and help the organisms warm up. Yeah, but check out the page online, because it has a whole lot of stuff there written about it.
And that wasn't the only question about compost, so I'm glad that you were able to get that in. There's a lot of very specific questions coming up about aphids and pest management, I think, specific to different regions and how they're being impacted. What's the best way to find out about, your specific pest in your area and how to treat it?
That's a very good question. A lot of areas have what's called master gardeners. They're people like you and me, totally interested in gardening, but they've gone the next degree. They've taken courses, they've learned a lot of important information, and they do a community service where they actually love to help answer questions to the community. So see if you've got a master gardener group that you can get on their newsletter, that you can ask them questions through a phone, email address or a phone number. That's a great resource. Sometimes the botanical gardens can have information to your local area. Sometimes if you have a nursery that's really knowledgeable and specialized, they can be very helpful too.
Oh, wonderful. There are so many questions that are here online, and I wish but we are in our last minute of our morning conversation. I think we could have talked all morning, because there's just so much as we get into the spring. People are so eager. I know myself, having been cooped up a little bit more lately in my house, and it was minus 18 the other day here in Edmonton, so it feels extra coopy, and I am very looking forward to getting outside, digging in the garden, seeing things grow in this time of uncertainty and what feels like isolation from our neighbors and our friends. And so, is there any last thing that you would like to leave our participants with today before we say goodbye?
Well, just again, that section that's been created just for this purpose called Reconnecting Canadians, hopefully you had a chance to write it down. If not, go to our website. It is like at one of the top banners there. It has a lot of ideas in terms of what you can do on your own with families, indoors, out, in terms of connecting with nature and supporting yourself through this time in this capacity. So hopefully that helps.
Wonderful. I'll be checking it out as well. So as Sarah mentioned, there'll be a survey going out, and if you complete it, you'll have access to all these resources. I know Sarah is available by email, and the Canadian Wildlife Federation has a very extensive website. So as Sarah mentioned, please reach out. Please investigate all those resources that are available. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful talking across Canada, from coast to coast. We've had over 200 participants involved, and it's been so wonderful hearing from everyone. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. And we'll speak to you again soon. Bye, everyone.
Great. Bye.